Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Nick's challenge, Lauren's new job, and Kane's rising enemy. According to Thursday, August 14th spoilers for The Young and the Restless, Lauren Fenmore Baldwin will be taking on a new role, and Kane Ashby's adversary will be on the rise. Here's what Y&R fans may anticipate from Nick Newman, who will also take on a challenge. First and foremost, Michael Graziadi's character Daniel Romalotti Jr. will reflect on his actual feelings for Tessa Porter and acknowledge that, at least for him, their friendship may be developing into something more. Naturally, Daniel won't be aware of Tessa's current situation, particularly given how uncertain her marriage is right now. Daniel might question whether he still has a shot with Tessa, though, as she is beginning to believe that her relationship with Mariah Copeland may be finished. On Thursday's Y&R episode, Daniel will confide in Danny Romalotti, who will probably give some guidance. Given the number of delicate aspects involved, Daniel might wish to emphasize the importance of exercising caution. On a more positive side, Danny can gladly tell his father that he's all in since he will need a best man for his impending wedding. Similarly, Laura Lee Bell's character Christine Blair will also require an advocate. Will Christine ask Lauren to be her matron of honor since she has a big request for her on Thursday's show? Christine could hope Lauren will be willing to stand up in place of Nina Webster, who is currently in a less than joyous mood due to the loss of Chance Chancellor. Lauren may have a lot of work ahead of her as she assists Christine with the last-minute wedding planning. Nick might accept that challenge if Victor Newman puts pressure on him, just like Lauren does. In the hopes that they can eliminate this menace completely, Victor will press Nick for assistance in taking down Kane. Victor might not need to put in much effort to convince Nick of this as he is now rather upset with Kane. Nick and Victor might both agree that they must play extra dirty if necessary in order to sink Kane. According to previews on The Young and the Restless, Nick might turn out to be more dangerous than Kane thought. Thursday, August 14th, on The Young and the Restless, the canvas of Genoa City will be painted with fresh ambition, lingering grudges, and unexpected power shifts, as three intertwining threads: Nick Newman's looming challenge, Lauren Fenmore Baldwin's surprising new role, and the dangerous rise of Kane Ashby's most determined adversary take center stage in ways that promise fallout no one will see coming. The day begins with Michael Graziadi's Daniel Romalotti Jr., whose contemplative mood betrays the fact that he's not just mulling over music or family obligations but rather confronting the creeping realization that his feelings for Tessa Porter have been quietly evolving into something far deeper, the kind of romantic pull that tempts him to cross a line he's never dared before, especially as whispers about Tessa's increasingly strained marriage to Mariah Copeland reach his ears and plant questions about whether fate is presenting him with an opening. Daniel's inner conflict is a potent mix of nostalgia and longing. Memories of shared laughter and late-night confessions swirl in his mind, yet he knows full well that acting on these impulses could blow up not just one but two friendships. So in a rare moment of vulnerability he turns to his father, Danny Romalotti, for counsel, trusting that the older man's romantic history, both the triumphs and the very public disasters, will yield some sort of clarity. But instead of cautioning him away from danger, Danny surprises Daniel with a philosophical shrug, reminding his son that love is messy, unpredictable, and sometimes worth the gamble, though he emphasizes that any move Daniel makes must be honest and respectful. The conversation takes a lighter turn when Danny, in the midst of his own whirlwind of change, invites Daniel to serve as his best man in his upcoming wedding, a role Daniel accepts with a smile despite the storm in his heart. And this leads neatly into Christine Blair's storyline, where Laura Lee Bell's poised yet quietly emotional Christine has a request of her own, having decided she wants her wedding to be a celebration that feels grounded in friendship and shared history. She reaches out to Lauren Fenmore Baldwin, not just as a confidant but with the specific hope that Lauren will serve as her matron of honor, a position originally intended for Nina Webster, whose grief over Chance Chancellor's death has left her unable to focus on celebrations of love. Lauren, moved by the gesture, agrees without hesitation. But she soon realizes the role is not merely symbolic. Christine needs tangible, hands-on help with last-minute wedding logistics, from calming down an overwhelmed florist to smoothing over a catering mishap involving two competing bakers. And Lauren dives in with her trademark blend of elegance and fierce efficiency, proving once again that she thrives under pressure. However, Lauren's new responsibilities extend beyond the wedding, as whispers emerge about her being Courted for a high-profile position on a corporate board tied to one of Genoa City's most influential fashion conglomerates, a move that would test her loyalty to Fenmore's and potentially put her in conflict with allies she's long counted on, though Christine encourages her to at least explore the opportunity, suggesting that a fresh chapter might not only energize her but also reframe her influence in town. Meanwhile, over at Newman Enterprises, the mood is far more combative as Victor Newman, ever the strategic patriarch, calls Nick into his office with the kind of tight-lipped urgency that signals trouble brewing. And indeed, trouble has a name: Kane Ashby. Victor has been monitoring Kane's increasingly bold moves in both business and social spheres, convinced that Kane's ambitions are edging too close to Newman territory and threatening to destabilize delicate alliances. And while Victor has often preferred to neutralize opponents quietly, this time he decides that a more aggressive, hands-on approach is necessary, one that will require Nick's full participation. Nick, already simmering with resentment over past clashes with Kane, resentment that's only deepened by recent rumors of Kane making power plays in areas that hit close to home, needs little convincing. And in a rare moment of full alignment, father and son agree to operate without gloves, willing to employ corporate pressure, strategic leaks to the press, and perhaps even a few back-channel deals with Kane's competitors to weaken his footing. What neither man knows yet is that Kane's newest and most dangerous enemy isn't them at all, but rather an outsider who's been quietly building influence in the shadows, someone with personal vendettas and resources that could dwarf Kane's own if unleashed. This adversary, whose identity is being kept tightly under wraps for now, has already begun probing Kane's operations for weaknesses, exploiting small vulnerabilities to create the impression of chaos. And while Kane senses that something is shifting against him, he hasn't yet connected the dots to see the full scope of the threat, instead assuming that Victor is his sole concern. This miscalculation could be his undoing, as the outsider's tactics are far more insidious than Newman's direct assault, relying on psychological warfare, covert alliances, and the kind of disinformation campaigns that can erode a man's reputation before he even realizes the walls are closing in. Back in Newman Towers, Nick considers the implications of Victor's plan, knowing that to truly take Kane down, he may have to operate in ways that compromise his own moral compass. Something he's tried to avoid despite years in his father's orbit, but the thought of Kane continuing to build influence, possibly targeting Newman family interests in the process, hardens his resolve. Lauren, too, is about to face her own test, as accepting the new corporate position could mean stepping into a volatile environment where her decisions will be scrutinized not only by business rivals but by old friends who may question her loyalty, forcing her to navigate a minefield of ambition and allegiance. And as all three storylines hurtle forward, Daniel torn between desire and loyalty, Lauren balancing friendship with professional temptation, and Nick squaring off against Kane under Victor's watchful eye, the stage is set for a convergence where personal and professional stakes collide. Alliances are tested in unexpected ways, and Kane, perhaps for the first time in a long while, finds himself not just playing offense but desperately scrambling for defense against an enemy who has no intention of backing down and may very well outmaneuver them all before anyone realizes the true scale of the game being played in Genoa City. By the time the sun dipped behind the skyline of Genoa City that Thursday evening, the carefully cultivated balance between ambition and alliance had already begun to wobble. And for Kane Ashby, the shift felt almost imperceptible at first: a slightly colder reception from a usually friendly investor, a delay in a contract signing he'd expected to go through without question, but Kane was a man who had learned to pay attention to the subtlest of tells. If a poker table could be read in the twitch of an eye or the tightening of a jaw, so could the world of business, and right now, the table felt loaded with bad cards he hadn't dealt, making him wonder who else might be shuffling the deck. Across town, Nick Newman was nursing a whiskey at society, thinking through Victor's instructions and weighing whether to take the most direct route, launching a targeted corporate strike that would put Kane on the defensive within days, or to play the long game, where subtle interference could slowly erode Kane's leverage until he had no choice but to fold. Nick knew his father's preference would always be swift, decisive action, but something in his gut told him that the enemy Kane feared most wasn't Newman Enterprises at all. And if that were true, charging in blindly could inadvertently strengthen the wrong player. What Nick didn't know was that the wrong player was already moving against Kane with surgical precision, cloaked in the identity of a newcomer to Genoa City society, a sharp-eyed, impeccably dressed woman named Amelia Vaughan, who had arrived under the guise of a philanthropic entrepreneur seeking partnerships with the city's most prominent families, her every move laced with charm and quiet calculation. Amelia's vendetta against Kane was deeply personal, rooted in a family betrayal that Kane himself didn't even realize had occurred, involving a business deal in Australia years earlier that had devastated her father's company and set Amelia on a lifelong mission to dismantle Ashby's empire brick by brick. She had been studying him for months before she set foot in town, memorizing his alliances, pinpointing his vulnerabilities, and perhaps most importantly, identifying the cracks in his public image that could be widened until even his staunchest supporters began to doubt him. Her opening salvo came in the form of a subtle whisper campaign, an offhand remark to a journalist friend here, a vague suggestion of unverified financial irregularities there, and while the stories never outright accused Kane of wrongdoing, they planted just enough suspicion to make potential partners pause. Kane, oblivious to the source, chalked it up to normal corporate jealousy, focusing instead on a dinner meeting with a shipping magnate that he hoped would secure a lucrative new trade route. But when that magnate abruptly cancelled citing unforeseen complications, Kane felt the first true prickle of unease. Meanwhile, Lauren Fenmore Baldwin was having a day that oscillated between exhilarating and exhausting, as Christine's wedding task seemed to multiply by the hour, florists needing decisions on centerpieces, a seamstress requesting emergency alterations, and a band leader wanting confirmation on the playlist. But Lauren's natural ability to juggle chaos with poise made her the perfect point person, and she even managed to squeeze in a lunch meeting with a representative from the global fashion conglomerate offering her the board seat. The offer was flattering, the terms generous, and the potential influence enormous, but Lauren couldn't ignore the possible repercussions. Fenmore's had been her life's work, her identity in many ways, and stepping onto a corporate board tied to a competing interest could be seen as betrayal by some, including allies she valued. She sought advice from Michael Baldwin, who encouraged her to think strategically but also warned that entering a corporate arena dominated by aggressive players could put her in the crosshairs of rival power brokers, especially if the role involved steering major decisions. What Lauren didn't realize was that Amelia Vaughan had already taken note of her potential move and was considering whether Lauren could be an asset or an obstacle in her campaign against Kane, calculating that aligning with someone of Lauren's influence could open doors while subtly feeding her disinformation about Kane's dealings. Back at Newman Enterprises, Victor pressed Nick for progress, his patience thin, warning that Kane's expansion into markets overlapping with Newman interests was accelerating, and if they didn't act quickly, they'd find themselves reacting instead of controlling the board. Nick, however, had begun quietly making his own inquiries, tapping contacts in both the corporate and social scenes to see if there was any truth to the odd murmurs about Kane's instability, and though nothing concrete emerged, the consistency of the whispers told him someone with reach was orchestrating them. Daniel Romalotti Jr., still wrestling with his Tessa dilemma, stumbled into this larger intrigue almost by accident when he overheard Amelia at Society speaking on the phone about Phase 2 and closing the net, phrases that stuck with him not because he understood them, but because the tone carried the same intensity he'd heard from his father in business negotiations. Daniel mentioned the conversation in passing to Lauren later that evening, framing it as idle gossip, but Lauren's instincts pricked at the description, wondering if this mysterious woman could be connected to the subtle shift she'd sensed in town over the past few days. Kane, for his part, began tracing the sudden chill from his business contacts back to a handful of events, noting that the same names kept popping up in proximity to the setbacks, and, though he still didn't have Amelia on his radar, he began to suspect that someone was playing a deeper game against him, possibly even Nick, given their history. Tensions finally sparked into open confrontation when Nick and Kane crossed paths at Crimson Lights, where a seemingly casual exchange about the weather quickly escalated into veiled barbs about territorial overreach and the dangers of underestimating your competition, leaving Sharon to step in before the conversation turned into a scene. After Nick left, Kane sat back with his coffee, replaying the exchange and wondering if Newman's sudden aggressiveness was meant to distract him from a second, unseen front in the war, an idea that unsettled him enough to prompt a late-night strategy session with his most trusted advisor, one that ended with a decision to hire an independent investigator to quietly track the source of the rumors and lost deals. Amelia, however, was already 2 steps ahead, anticipating that Kane would start looking and planting false leads that would point toward minor rivals, keeping her own name completely out of the equation. By Friday morning, the battle lines in Genoa City were shifting yet again. Lauren stood on the verge of accepting the board seat, unaware that doing so might entangle her in Amelia's scheme. Nick prepared to launch a targeted move against Kane without realizing he might be striking in the wrong direction, and Kane braced himself for a fight he thought he understood, but which in reality was far more dangerous, as his true enemy smiled across a candlelit table at a charity gala, sipping champagne and plotting her next move, confident that by the time anyone discovered her involvement, it would be far too late to stop her. By late Friday afternoon, the tempo in Genoa City had shifted from cautious maneuvering to something closer to a low, relentless drumbeat of pressure, and each of the players in this quiet war felt it in their own way. Kane Ashby, pacing the length of his office, couldn't shake the gnawing sense that he was already a step behind. No matter how quickly he moved, his investigator's preliminary report had come in, naming 2 smaller competitors as possible sources of the sabotage, but the explanation felt too tidy, too obvious, like bait dangling on a hook. Kane knew that in business, the real predators rarely announced themselves this early. Across town at Newman Enterprises, Nick Newman was in his own holding pattern, reviewing a proposal that would cut off one of Kane's primary distribution channels, a move that would hit the Ashby operation hard without leaving Newman fingerprints, but a call from an old contact at the Genoa City Chronicle stopped him cold. The contact, a reporter who'd always played it straight, mentioned off-record that there was another shark in the water circling Kane, someone with resources and a long memory. And though the name Amelia Vaughan never crossed the reporter's lips, the implication was clear. Victor might not have the only play in motion, and if Nick didn't watch his step, he could wind up being someone else's pawn. Lauren Fenmore Baldwin, meanwhile, was stepping out of a strategy luncheon for the potential new corporate board role when she spotted Amelia herself across the lobby, engaged in animated conversation with a well-connected charity director. Their eyes met briefly, Amelia offering a polished, almost disarming smile, and Lauren, not usually one to be caught off guard, found herself momentarily wondering if they'd met before. Later, over coffee with Christine, Lauren mentioned the encounter, describing Amelia as someone you'd expect to see holding court at an Upper East Side fundraiser, and Christine, with her prosecutor's instinct, suggested she do a little background check before engaging further. Lauren agreed in theory, but the truth was Amelia had already begun to occupy a small, persistent corner of her curiosity. That night, Amelia set the next phase of her plan in motion at the Genoa City Arts Foundation Gala, where the town's power players gathered under the guise of supporting local culture. She moved through the room like a seasoned diplomat, never lingering too long in one circle, but making sure her laughter and her quiet, knowing glances left an impression. Nick spotted her from across the room, watching as she greeted Victor with the kind of warmth that suggested prior acquaintance. He didn't like the ease between them, and even more troubling was the way Victor seemed genuinely engaged, leaning in as she spoke. When Nick later asked his father about her, Victor dismissed her as a businesswoman with some interesting proposals, but the evasiveness in his tone made Nick wonder if Victor was holding back. Kane arrived late to the gala, his mood already soured by a day of stalled negotiations and vague answers from contacts who once jumped at his calls. He noticed the subtle shift in body language when he entered certain conversations, a hesitation before a handshake, a too quick change of subject, and though no one said anything outright, the chill was unmistakable. When he finally crossed paths with Amelia, he didn't know her name, but there was something in her gaze that struck him, a confidence bordering on familiarity, like someone who already knew more about him than he'd said aloud. Their exchange was polite, even cordial, but as she drifted away to speak with Lauren, Kane caught himself watching her, wondering why his instincts screamed that this woman was not to be underestimated. Lauren's brief conversation with Amelia was innocuous on the surface, mutual compliments on the evening's decor, a shared laugh over the catering, but Amelia deftly slipped in a question about Kane's recent business expansions, phrased as casual interest. Lauren gave a diplomatic, non-committal answer, but noted how intently Amelia listened, as if filing the information away. When Lauren later relayed the moment to Michael, he warned her that Amelia sounded like someone probing for weaknesses, though he admitted she was doing it with exceptional subtlety. By the end of the evening, Amelia had managed to secure dinner invitations from 2 key investors who had been considering partnerships with Kane, and each would, in the coming weeks, find compelling reasons to delay those talks indefinitely. The beauty of Amelia's approach was that she never outright sabotaged, She simply redirected, planting seeds of doubt and offering alternative opportunities that just happened to steer people away from Kane. From Kane's perspective, it looked like bad timing and shifting priorities. From Amelia's, it was the clean execution of a strategy she'd been refining for years. Nick left the gala with more questions than answers, his instincts telling him that Amelia's presence in Genoa City was no coincidence. He resolved to dig deeper, even if it meant going against Victor's implied directive to stay focused on Kane. And Kane, driving home through the quiet streets, decided his investigator's next assignment would be to identify every new player who had stepped into his orbit in the last month, because if his gut was right, his biggest problem wasn't a Newman at all. It was someone he'd barely met, but who might already be holding the strings to his fate.